So for this tutorial, they're looking for some detailed examples of two or more societies with contrasting vulnerability. So these are not full case studies, but they are quite detailed examples, place examples of where vulnerability can be seen in their societies. I think it's an interesting thing just to stop and think, well, how do we develop this conceptually? So when we mean by societies, we think about human populations. And we could probably develop this around contrasting these societies in terms of perhaps their economic development or perhaps their regional location. But a really good concept here is to be thinking about scale. So could we look at things from a national perspective? Could we change that scale to the regional and local? And so that's what I've tried to do in the three examples which we'll use. So they are Haiti, the national scale, and we've got the Sundarbans region of South India. So we've got a regional example there. And then actually we've got a more focus on the Yennet Peninsula in Russia. And there we have an indigenous society. So we're localizing it there, going from the national to the local. So what is vulnerability again? Well, vulnerability is equal to the degree of sensitivity to climate change as well as its exposure to it. And that will also take into account the adaptive capacity of that society to reduce exposure. I think we need to be thinking about then, well, what factors combine to produce vulnerability? Well, you've got the environmental system itself. How is that system subject to shocks, environmental issues relating to climate change? How well will that system respond and absorb those shocks? You've got then the human system alongside it. What factors are most at risk there? Is there a big exposure to communities? Is there an exposure to water or food yields? And then what capacity is there in that society in terms of its governance and its institutions to respond to those factors? And those three issues all combine to increase vulnerability. So I think one thing that you might want to consider is pausing this, using these as revision cards and spending more time looking at these examples. So the first one we'll look at is Haiti. It's located in the Caribbean. It's a tropical region. It's also a coastal region. It's also a very low-income country. So these factors make it the third most vulnerable country in the world, according to the Vulnerability Index on climate change. And it's really exposed to quite a lot of impacts. So it's experiencing higher temperatures with that severe droughts. It's getting disruption to its wet season. So a 3-month wet season is being delayed. So that creates uncertainty. There is sea level rise. This brings about storm surges, salt intrusion into coastal fields and agricultural areas, and of course, increased frequency and severity of hurricanes. So their vulnerability factors here in Haiti relate to rapid soil erosion. This is brought about and exacerbated by widespread deforestation. Haiti is famed for its lack of forestry management, and it's almost full deforestation. We've got then flooding. This is increased by deforestation as well because sediment and soil erosion chokes river systems. You combine that with population pressure, a 1.5% population growth, and actually a government neglect of its farming sector, you can see actually this is a population which is highly vulnerable. So we've got human impacts such as its fall in crop yields, and it has a high dependency on food imports. So you have very high levels of food security already. Climate change is going to exacerbate that in Haiti. So that gets us thinking about, well, government and the adaptive capacity there. So, hurricanes is one major issue, but they have a shortage of hurricane shelters on their coastal plains. And combined with that, they just don't have emergency food supplies and emergency supplies full stop to manage these types of disasters. Of course, we saw that in the earthquake as well, where they were just dependent on foreign support. They have a lack of forestry and agricultural policies. And so this is only going to increase kind of reductions in food yields, increased soil erosion, choking river systems, and then they have limited water and irrigation policies. If we start to look at kind of development strategies, women's education on climate change and women's education on land management is lacking. And they have a massive high aid donor dependency. 50% of its state budget comes from foreign donors. So there seems to be a real lack of institutions there, and quality governance is kind of unable to provide the adaptive capacity. And that's combined with an absolute serious absence of community engagement, citizen engagement and consultation. And so actually what we talk about here then is poor social capital, low levels of trust in the institutions, low levels of trust and community collaboration. And so all of these factors here combine to make Haiti the third most vulnerable country. If we look at the Sundarbans, we've got quite a similar geographical kind of context here. Again, a tropical region, it's a coastal community. And this is, India itself is rated the 27th most vulnerable state, so high levels of vulnerability still, but lower than Haiti. And again, quite similar climate change impacts. So we're seeing higher temperatures, severe droughts, sea level rise. But the Sundarbans is subject to massive rates of erosion. So with a 25 centimetre rise in sea level, we'd have a 40% loss of that land area. With a 45 centimetre rise in sea level, we'd see a 70% loss. We've got rising ocean temperature there. Remember, thermal expansion comes from that as well. And storm surges leading to salt intrusion, which lowers food yields. We have increased frequency and severity of cyclones. We have a disrupted monsoon, which the agricultural systems rely on so much. And so this creates quite a varied food insecurity issue. And when we see about this idea of monsoons, the uncertainty of when they arrive, the uncertainty of where they actually reach India, that's having a big impact. The Sundarbans does have a massively high population density, over 1,000 people per square kilometre. It's already arguably exceeding its environmental carrying capacity. It's also experiencing population growth. So when you combine these human factors with sea level rise, salt intrusion, massive erosion of the Sundarbans, salinization, you've got this major problem. Of course, people need land, they need areas to farm, and this has led to widespread deforestation of mangroves, which is that natural buffer in these communities, in these coastal areas, that prevents storm surges, or at least absorbs the impacts of these storm surges. So again, we've got the human impacts here being largely just food security. Of course, if you can't feed your families, that's going to lead to widespread out migration. And so actually the problems here for India with that out migration, that forced environmental migration, you could call these climate change refugees, you get all that civil tension and conflict due to these rising rapid urbanizations. And sometimes you get ethnic conflicts in Bangladesh, which are, can rise up very quickly and can be quite violent incidents. And that threat there of conflict within urban environments as a result of kind of climate change refugees is definitely a problem. And it links back again to social capital, doesn't it, there, where networks of support, networks of community just maybe lacking there when put to shocks which climate change will bring. So in terms of the adaptive capacity, again, there are real problems. There's a lack of land use policy. So this is what's led to the overexploitation of mangroves in the first place. This increases the impacts of storm surges on communities. It increases rates of soil erosion. It increases salt intrusion. And so there's no real decentralized policy, no regionalized policy for agricultural development there. That's really lacking. And there's a lack of employment opportunities around sustainable forestry. which needs to be developed if they're going to respond and manage to the threats of climate change. You've got the UN REDD scheme, which is there to compensate for forest growth as well, for the sequestration of carbon into these forests, these mangroves. But that's a kind of a failing scheme. It's not quick to actually reach policy and actually be active. So that's an issue as well in the Sundarbans. The third example we've got then is the Yamal Peninsula. And this is actually a little bit different. So what we're doing here is we're changing the scale. Yeah, it's a regional location. It's now kind of polar region. And so it's facing different environmental threats and different human challenges. Now, the Arctic region as a whole is increasing in some places 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. I think the Yamal Peninsula is 1.5 times the global average. It's mainly occurring through warmer winters, shorter winters, these longer summers as well, and much warmer summers, thawing permafrost, and actually the thermokarst lakes, these lakes which are found within the permafrost, because they're thawing, they're breaking up and leading to quite large outburst floods, which means it in fact takes away fresh water sources. It also takes away food supply for the Nenets people, this nomadic group. So the vulnerability factors are, well, they are nomadic, and so they migrate with their reindeer herds. This is increasing. Their migration basically is becoming longer and longer. They have to spend more time in the north, which is more remote and it's more hostile. And so that's impacting their migration routes as well. There's lots of seasonal migration that's taking place, and that brings about all sorts of challenges around access to food, access to medical care, their exposure to diseases, and of course, essentially, food security. So you get community isolation here with the Nenets people, a lack of access to medical care, loss of food supplies because the fish are removed from these outburst lakes. And there's been some incidents already of anthrax outbreaks from when the reindeer, frozen remains of reindeer that were in the permafrost have been sort of revealed. And so health effects have had a major impact on reindeer herds, and there's been loss of life amongst the Nenets people there. So one of the options is, without government support, this idea of settling the communities within towns, and that brings about massive lifestyle change. This idea of tribes in transition, nomadic people that lack skills for living in towns. And so that's challenging in itself. Now, there is capacity in Russia, of course, to provide the human resources. They can, of course, manage disease outbreaks. They've done that very well, and they've put lots of resources into managing that and developing vaccines. Really what it comes down to is whether there is government will to support the nomadic way of life. And if that becomes costly, will the Russian government want to do that? And for the Nenets people, if they're increasingly being placed in towns and taken away from their nomadic lifestyle, well, then they're exposed to the problems, the social issues that arise: substance abuse, alcohol abuse, high unemployment, and the poor health that goes with those kind of social problems. So this is an indigenous group of people. It's a very localized region, highly vulnerable. Russia itself is considered really quite modest and moderately exposed to vulnerability with climate change. But when you see a group of people like the Nenets here, they're far more exposed to the risks of climate change.